In this recording, we'll explore some of the challenges that face virtual teams, and we'll talk about some things that we need to be thinking about as leaders when we're working in a virtual environment. So this picture here shows how there's pressures on virtual teams, and they get more challenging when we have diversity in combination with dispersion. So if diversity is present, so if we have cultural diversity, if these are global virtual teams, if we have functional diversity, if they're cross-cultural or interdisciplinary teams, if we have organizational diversity, if they're from different units of our own company, or if we're spanning organizations with teams involving members from customers or members from suppliers, all of those challenges we've already discussed in class, that those sources of diversity are important and can benefit the team, but they make it harder for people to have a common mental model. They elevate the need for a transactive memory system to develop, and they can be the source of misunderstandings and miscommunication and conflict, and especially if they happen to line up in a fault line, really create some difficulty for the team. Now, on the right side, if we also add in here dispersion, right, where we have virtuality, where we have people who are not present face to face, this gets more and more challenging if it's different time zones, because coordination becomes more difficult. If there's different infrastructure, so many of us are facing this now in the virtual world that we're living in with the coronavirus. I think about the particular challenges being faced by K through 12 educators, where the infrastructure available to their students is going to vary widely, and the capability of both children and parents and their tech savvy is going to vary quite a bit in terms of their capabilities to work together. And then contexts themselves, if we have cultural differences, a team may be located in one context in one country, or it may be located in two contexts. I've studied teams that have, about half and half of their members from the US and from Germany. Things get more complex if the team has members from multiple different time zones spread across the world and multiple different national culture contexts. Those are much more complex experiences. So the two of these pressures generate extra challenges for virtual teams. And as they rise up on both sides, increasing diversity and increasing dispersion, we're going to have greater complexity, more invisible problems in terms of not really understanding the situations facing team members. For instance, I did some research years ago, a big study of cultural differences in teams, and one location of that research study was in the Philippines, and we happened to be in Manila when there was a major typhoon. And the city of Manila, it's a statistic something like 50 to 80% of the city's below sea level, and so it's just a natural flood basin when the typhoons happen. And when we were there, that's what happened, and we would see news reports that would explain that people are stuck in their cars for 24, 36, 48 hours because the freeways were so jammed up because of flooding that people couldn't get home from work or couldn't get to work. So there's this invisibility if you're not aware of natural disasters or even kind of basic challenges that are happening in a context. And if you have people from your team in multiple places and you don't know what's happening, you may not know what they're facing. Likewise, you may not understand what capabilities they have in their location, their subsidiary. Some of it might be very helpful to your team, but because you're not present and you never got to actually see what the facilities are, you don't know what knowledge or what capabilities are there. It's in a way an extra challenge to the development of transactive memory systems. So when we think about those pressures of different forms of diversity and dispersion that are common in virtual teams, as team members and team leaders, it's really important for us to search for the source of communication problems. It's just a fact that communication will be more challenged in virtual teams, And as there's more diversity present and dispersion present, this will get harder. If there's challenges to communication, it might not be the technology causing the problem. It might not be the fact that there's a time zone difference and you're not having synchronous opportunities to talk to each other. It could be language, or it could be cultural misunderstandings. And we're going to talk a little bit about those two things in class, but a deep dive into cultural differences and how those affect teamwork is beyond the scope of this class. If you're interested, I suggest you think about taking my class, which is Management 6310 in the J term, which is cross-cultural management. And we get into a great deal of detail in how culture can affect work, and in particular affect teamwork. So, but clearly, sometimes when you think there's a misunderstanding, it might not be because of simple problems with communication technology. It might be because of cultural differences in understanding and reading cues. And that gets harder and harder if we're talking about less rich communication. So text-based communication versus voice communication versus video communication. So differentiating between, what the source of the problem is easier said than done when you're not having a chance to be face to face. And of course, if you really have never had a chance to meet each other face to face, then you have to work very hard to give people the benefit of the doubt and to search for a reason that you may not attribute to some malicious cause, like people not participating or not caring or not really working the way that they should be working. So misinterpretation in virtual teams occurs for a wide variety of reasons, but part of it is this in-group, out-group, similar versus different challenge that we have. And this is the case, it's just sort of a basic psychological, social psychological fact that things that are different from what we're used to, we tend to have a sense of fear or have a sense of disregarding. So we have a tendency to interpret things that are different with negative attitudes. The challenge is that in global companies, and when we put together global teams, global virtual teams, the precise reason we're trying to do that is to access the difference. So we have this kind of double-edged sword problem that we need the difference. The difference is part of why the team's together. But if a problem occurs, we tend to blame the difference. So we have to work extra hard in virtual teams to avoid these kind of knee-jerk attributions. And if there's some miscommunication, try to escalate things up to a better, more rich form of communication. Try to ask and assume there's been a misunderstanding before there's an assumption that there's been a kind of a blatant or malicious attempt to either derail or not cover something that's being needed in the team. Catherine Crampton was one of the very early people doing scholarship on virtual teams, and her work still stands pretty well today in terms of some of the particular challenges that working virtually creates for people. One thing is we don't communicate and remember that contextual information. We don't remember what the circumstances are for people. We might even not remember or check in on dates or holidays or changes in time zones, and we might have miscommunications or miscues about when we're meeting or what we're trying to accomplish because we just don't keep track of those things. Challenges with uneven communication participation are even worse in this environment. We know some research that extroverts are more comfortable working in virtual environments than introverts. So it's even harder sometimes for people with certain personalities to participate evenly in these kinds of conversations. So all of the challenges we have, from common information effect to uneven communication networks, get worse in a virtual environment. And if that virtual environment's aligned with cultural and geographic distance, these are even more challenging. So the tools of structuring discussion, checking in to make sure everyone's participating, developing norms of mindfulness, all of those things become even more important in this context. The people have different expectations for speed and timing, and we'll get into that with respect to culture that's even kind of more of an issue than just the technology mediation. And questions about when people aren't available, when they don't show up, when they don't respond, can create all sorts of conflict. And people often, again, sort of jump to conclusions that failure to respond is information about maybe conflict or disagreement, when in fact it might be just pure misunderstanding or some kind of technical difficulties going on. So that idea of mindfulness to reduce the judgmental processing is even more important. And so to the extent to which leaders can establish norms of mindfulness in virtual teams, is even more important to their effectiveness. A summary, the overall, consequences for virtual teams of these challenges are that we tend to see more emphasis on dispositional rather than situational attribution. So you should have heard before in your Leading Others class, or hopefully in a psychology class, the difference between dispositional versus situational attributions. The fundamental attribution error is that if somebody fails to deliver or doesn't perform to our expectations, we tend to blame the person, their disposition. We tend to think about it as a problem of their motivation or their personality or their values or just some other characteristic of the person. Instead of thinking about what could be happening in this situation, what are the extra challenges? Do we know if those virtual team members are part of other teams? If they have multi-team membership, we already know from other course content that their capabilities may be stretched and pulled in different directions. So their failure to deliver what we want or be present in a call or be present in a meeting might not be because of some personal quality. And the challenge is, if we allow ourselves to jump to a personal dispositional blame, we can elevate that relationship conflict, and we can undermine trust and undermine psychological safety, all of which will harm the capability of the team. And we will reduce the chance that we're going to be able to learn from the different perspectives that the team was formed to access in the first place. And ultimately, in the end, these kinds of things mean that in virtual teams, I think it's just easier to harm relationships than in face-to-face teams. And it's harder to think about redeveloping those and generating social capital and having team effectiveness in terms of feeling satisfied and identified with the team. So extra effort needs to be taken in distributed teamwork to try to make those personal connections. So in the next video, I'll talk a little bit about what we can do as team members and team leaders to try to enhance and overcome some of these particular challenges of technology-mediated work.